Good morning. Hello. So glad to see you all here. It's 9:40. We're going to begin. Hello. Good morning. I already told Travis that I have sinned. I've used both the words busy and hurry, and I told my husband it would be okay if he broke the speed limit getting here this morning. Yeah. That's right. I have things to work on, which I need to do. Yes, thank you. We do welcome Travis West here today. We're very excited to have Travis come. I can say that Travis in 2002 earned his bachelor's from what was then Calvin College. We don't need to talk more about that. In 2008, earned his MDiv at Western Seminary. And quickly thereafter, in 2009, his master's in theology. He's ordained in the Reformed Church in America. And in 2018, earned his PhD in the Netherlands. And I was going to ask you how to pronounce this, but I was also going to tell you that with my hearing loss, I probably won't be able to catch the pronunciation anyway. So maybe you can say.
Sure, it's the Vrije Universiteit.
The
Vrije Universiteit.
Universiteit.
Yes.
Okay.
The Free University.
Free University. Okay. In Amsterdam.
It was. It was free. It was. It really was.
Ah. Others may want to pursue that conversation.
It's not as free anymore, but it was when I went through.
Travis is the professor, as you know, of Hebrew and Old Testament at Western. He's the author of 4 books. And before he starts talking about his latest one, The Sabbath Way, I just want to share this paragraph that he wrote about himself that I really appreciated. He said, "When I'm not in the classroom or at the writing desk, I can generally be found searching for wonder while walking the fields near my house, listening to a book or laughing along with the Smartless podcast, experimenting with nature or bird photography, going to a farmer's market, watching a movie, or hanging out with Mariah, who is my most consistent source of delight and amazement." Welcome, Travis. We're glad to have you here today.
Thank you so much. Well, good morning, friends. It's really a delight to me to be here with you all and to share a little bit about the book with you, which has been a passion project of mine for the past several years. And it's also deeply gratifying to me that you as a church, or some of you at least, are reading the book throughout this month. And that means a lot to me. And I'm going to try to leave a good amount of time for question and answer at the end, so that those of you who have already started to engage with the book can ask some questions about it if you have them, or we can just talk about the Sabbath together at the end. I'd like to begin with a poem. Poetry has been a really important part of my Sabbath practice for many years, partly because when you read a poem, the page itself is formatted in a way that invites you into a life with margins. It invites you to slow down. There's very few words on the page. There's wide margins, and those words have been very carefully chosen. And so the invitation is to slow down, to pay attention, to see the world through another person's, through the poet's perspective. And so I want to read a poem simply because I think it's a very Sabbathy thing to do. But I also want to read this poem because I think this poem articulates something fundamental about the Sabbath invitation. It's called Clearing by Martha Postlethwaite. And I waited to change the slide because I didn't want any of you to read it ahead of time. Okay, here it is. It's called Clearing. Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world so worthy of rescue. I'm going to read it one more time. Do not try to save the whole world or do anything grandiose. Instead, create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world so worthy of rescue. I want to just invite you to turn to a neighbor and share what is a word or a phrase in this poem that really stood out to you. I love a crowd that's willing to engage poetry. This is good. This is good. Why don't we come back together? One of the words that I just cannot get over every time I read this poem is the dense forest that is your life. I've been practicing Sabbath. My wife and I have been practicing Sabbath for 18 years. Every week, I mean, there are very, very few weeks we have missed in the last 18 years. And somehow my life still often feels like a dense forest. And that's, I think, part of the urgency of why that drove me to write the book, actually, because I'll say this a little bit later, but for so many years, our Sabbath practice was so disconnected from the rest of our lives that it had almost no impact on how we lived 6 days of the week. And I think that is counter to the biblical vision of the Sabbath. As I talk about in the book, the Sabbath is not just a practice that we do once a week. It's an add-on, an appendage to the week, but rather it's a posture that we inhabit every day of the week. And it's not that practicing Sabbath can make our whole life a clearing, but maybe it can clear out some of the underbrush so it doesn't feel quite so dense. Well, thanks for engaging that. I want to just share a little bit about why I wrote this book, and then I'll share a little bit about what I learned in the process of writing it, and then we can talk about it. The first reason that I wrote the book was deeply selfish. I wrote it for myself. As I said, Mariah and I had been practicing Sabbath since 2007, I started writing it in January of 2021, and it grew out of a class that I taught at the seminary in the fall of 2019. And so I've been thinking very carefully and consistently about the Sabbath for a long time. But in 2019, the reason I taught the class was because we had been practicing at that point Sabbath for 12 years. And when we first adopted a Sabbath practice, we had no context to understand what we were adopting. Neither of us had had a Sabbath practice as children. Sunday was a day just like every other day outside of going to church and eating a family meal. And we had no kind of familial rhythms that we were invited into or that shaped our life. And then when I was a student in seminary, a few years after we were married, we spent a summer in Jerusalem. And I was studying biblical Hebrew. Those of you who've read the book know a little bit about this story. But I was studying biblical Hebrew, exploring potential vocation as an Old Testament professor. And we encountered kind of civic Sabbath that is still practiced in Israel today. The buses shut down, all the Jewish shops closed. You couldn't go anywhere. No one was on the streets. Everything shut down. And we sort of found ourselves kind of with a Sabbath imposed on us almost. And it was absolutely life-giving. It was everything that we were looking for that we hadn't known how to find. And so we came back from that summer experience with a deep conviction to organize our life around this practice. But we came back to Michigan, and all the buses kept running, and all the shops stayed open, and all the professors kept assigning me homework to do over the weekends, and life just kept moving at the pace that it does. And so we were completely out of sorts and had no idea how to sustain this life-giving rhythm that we had found when the culture around us didn't enable it and support it and encourage us in it. And so we read books, we kind of made it up as we went along. But what happened was, because we didn't have guides or models or mentors in living this way, what happened was we developed what Eugene Peterson once memorably called a bastard Sabbath. And that our Sabbath practice was indistinguishable from a day off. It was not a Sabbath. It was just, as I was referring earlier, it was just a day entirely separate from the rest of the week. So our rhythm eventually became rush, 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 go, 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 collapse. Rush, 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 go, 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 collapse. And that Sabbath day was the day that we collapsed into. And what happened in that rhythm is that the collapse day, our Sabbath day, ended up being enslaved to our work week. So all its function was to help us to continue to sprint on the treadmill throughout the week at an unsustainable pace. So we would sprint for 6 days on the treadmill, leap off of it, get a shot in the arm of adrenaline, jump back on and run for 6 days. And that's not the biblical vision of Sabbath. And eventually we came to realize this, but I started teaching the class and then I started writing the book because I knew that our Sabbath practice needed help. I needed to force myself to be creative and more intentional about integrating our Sabbath day and the rest of our lives together. And that insight came to me after rereading Abraham Heschel's book, The Sabbath. Anybody here read Heschel's book? It's an absolute classic, and it changed my life. In there is a sentence, I should have written it down, I'm going to butcher it. His writing is so poetic and evocative. But he said something like, the Sabbath cannot survive wandering in exile through days of profanity. every day has to be spiritually consistent with the Day of Days. And what he's suggesting there is that the Sabbath, again, is not an add-on. It's not something you tack on to the end of the week. It's actually the climax of the week, and it sets the tone for the rest of the week. And also, it's not in service to the week. The purpose of Sabbath is not to enable greater productivity. The point of the week is to usher you into a Sabbath celebration. Work gives way to rest. Rest doesn't enable work in the biblical model. And so kind of discovering this, the interesting thing is that healthy rest actually does enable greater productivity. But Sabbath is not utilitarian in that sense. You get the difference? Yeah. So it was a process of self-discovery for me, realizing that our Sabbath practice was a shadow of a biblical Sabbath. And I wanted to force myself and force Mariah and I to have serious and intentional and creative conversations about how to center our Sabbath practice as the anchor or the point of orientation around which our whole life would revolve, instead of it being this day to collapse into each week. And eventually, over time, I shifted from it being really a process of self-discovery to me having deep convictions on the power of the Sabbath. And I wanted to then share that with the world, because I wanted to offer the world what the Sabbath had offered me, what I had discovered in the process. And so I shifted, and this was early on in the writing process. I realized that Sabbath is a central and essential practice of Christian discipleship. And it's an ancient rhythm with profound contemporary relevance. And I think it's as relevant today as it has ever been. And I wanted to articulate a vision of what Sabbath could be, but also to help clarify what Sabbath isn't and what Sabbath won't do. And so I'd like to just read a paragraph or so that describes part of my vision of Sabbath and my hope of what people will experience when they read the book. My hope is that you will find ways of experiencing the rest your soul craves. Now, the Sabbath cannot make your children fall asleep at night or stop them from crying. It can't resolve tensions between coworkers, secure a raise, or complete your never-ending to-do list. It cannot snap its fingers and make your stress go away, resolve the tensions in your marriage, or heal the body of someone you love. But what it can do is give you space to process those dynamics and the complex emotions that they create. It can reconnect you to gratitude by teaching you to live in the present moment. It can remind you of your priorities and expose the ways that your life is out of sync with those priorities. It can empower you to live as an act of protest against the forces that equate your value with what you do or what you can't do. It can make room for you to laugh and cry and sing and dance and sleep and play. In short, it can reorient you toward what brings you joy and delight, what makes you you. And this word delight was really central for me. That's why I put it in the subtitle. The subtitle is Making Room in Your Life for Rest, Connection, and Delight. When I was a kid, delight was never in the conversation about Sabbath. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Sabbath was a day of prohibitions. It was a day of don'ts, a day of boundaries around. It created a space, but it didn't fill that space with anything meaningful. So I wanted in the book to reconnect Sabbath with delight. It was a really important part for me. But also, delight, I understand delight as that experience of being fully alive in a present moment, in whatever moment you're in. That rush of energy that happens when you're fully alive, fully present in a moment. And that is very often, you experience that very often when you're around the people that you love, or you're in a place that you love, or you're doing something that you love. You feel that sense of aliveness. And I think that's really what the Sabbath invitation is, to prioritize those people, those places, and those activities where you feel deeply alive, deeply yourself, where you reconnect with that part of you that you might get severed from or disconnected from throughout the work week. Or if you're retired, throughout whatever you do during the week. To reconnect with that sense of wholeness, that sense of the deep sense of self. And so this rabbinic tale feels very Sabbathy to me. Rabbi Zusia once said that in the coming world they will not ask me, why were you not Moses? They will ask me, why were you not Zusia? The Sabbath is an invitation week after week after week to reconnect with what makes us uniquely ourselves, what makes Travis uniquely Travis, what makes Mariah uniquely Mariah, what makes Dawn uniquely Dawn. It's an invitation to not only do those things, but reflect on, get perspective on the ways in which we're living that disconnect us from what makes us fully ourselves. Well, the wisdom of Zusia is also reflected in the contemporary film Kung Fu Panda. Anybody seen Kung Fu Panda 3? One of my favorite movie trilogies, the Kung Fu Panda trilogies. It's worth watching if you haven't seen it. But there's a scene when Shifu, this is Master Shifu at the bottom, and this is Po, the dragon warrior, obviously. And in the third film, Shifu is teaching Po how to be a teacher. And Po is completely out of sorts, and as you can see by his face. And Shifu says, I'm not trying to turn you into me. I'm trying to turn you into you. And that's another way that the Sabbath helps us. It apprentices us in becoming ourselves over the course of our lives. Jesus said that the Sabbath is for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, in that sense, serves our humanity. It helps us become human again, helps us become a human being again, not a human doing. So the third reason why I wrote the book is because the Sabbath inheritance that I received was a Sabbath of just don't do it. I think Sabbath has been misunderstood by the inheritance of the Puritan legalistic Sabbath for many years. What I would describe as the tentacles of Puritanism. Thank you, ChatGPT, for this tentacled image. That the tentacles of Puritanism, I think, cling to the Sabbath imagination today. They deeply clung to my Sabbath imagination when Mariah and I started practicing Sabbath. That Sabbath was primarily, as I said earlier, a day of prohibitions, a day of don'ts. The emphasis fell on the Sabbath no. But there was nothing that no served. And what I discovered, I'm anticipating this a little bit, what I discovered in writing the book is that the Sabbath no actually serves a Sabbath yes. We have to have a Sabbath no. The word means cease. And in the biblical model of Sabbath, it is about not working. It's about creating a boundary around the work that we do that that has a tendency to enslave us or to define our identity based on what we do, how productive we are, how many bricks we can make for Pharaoh. The Sabbath says no to that, but it also, that no is creating the space for the Sabbath yes to emerge. The Sabbath yes is a yes to life, to delight, to joy, to connection, to gratitude, to contentment, to rest. And that's what the Sabbath of my grandparents was missing. The Sabbath of my grandparents was just a Sabbath no. It didn't have that corresponding yes to it. And Gerald May has written this sort of articulates what I'm trying to say, I think, better than the last 3 paragraphs that I just said could. The religious Sabbath is apt to feel like restriction rather than freedom, confinement rather than space. Instead of freedom from having to work, Sabbath came to mean not being allowed to work. You feel that distinction? It's subtle, but it's really significant in terms of our lived experience. And part of trying to write the book was trying to shift the conversation away from not being allowed to work to the liberative aspect of Sabbath to be more felt and tangible, that we're freed from having to work. So I want to offer 7 things that I learned in writing the book, and then we'll break for questions. The first one I already said. Oh, also 7, very important Sabbath word. I could have written 40 things that I learned, or 12, and there's all kinds of wonderful numbers, but 7 is really the Sabbath number. So 7 things I learned. The Sabbath no is important, but it serves the Sabbath yes. I already shared a little bit about that. The second thing is that Sabbath apprentices us in what Eugene Peterson called the rhythms of grace. And the rhythms of grace he's reflecting to here there are 2 rhythms of grace that emerge from the Genesis 1 account of creation, which of course is where we are first introduced to Sabbath in Scripture. Sabbath is the climax of the first page of the Bible. It's the reason the whole initial creation poem is given. Sorry, it's not us humans. We are not the climax of creation. It is rest and delight and connection between God and what God made. That's the climax of creation. And in that story, there are 2 rhythms of grace that are subtle, and we're often liable to miss them. And so Eugene Peterson helped me notice them. And I love this language of us being apprenticed into these rhythms week after week. So the 2 rhythms are, the first one is, does anybody recall on what day humans were created in the Sabbath poem? Day being in quotes. Anybody remember? The 6th day. Yes, the 6th day. Great. And at what point on the day were humans created? Beginning, middle, end? Anybody? It's the end. They were the last elements of creation created. First the animals, then humans. And then God stood back and saw the whole span of what God had made, and it was very good, and it was evening, and it was morning. Day 6 had come to an end. So the humans are created at the end of day 6. So what is their first real meaningful experience of time in creation? Rest. Their first day of living is Sabbath, which suggests they did not have to earn their Sabbath with God by working for 6 days. They didn't have to complete their work. They didn't even have to begin their work. Their existence began with rest and delight and connection with God and all of creation. So that's the first rhythm of grace. That grace comes before. Grace is fundamentally something that is a gift. We can't earn it. And Sabbath is fundamentally a gift. We cannot earn it by completing our work. The second rhythm of grace has to do with the way in which the narrator describes time on the first 6 days of creation. So when does the day begin in creation? Evening. Day begins in evening. Why? It was evening, it was morning, day 1. It was evening, it was morning, day 2. Evening, morning, day 3, right? So the day in the Jewish framework and also in the Old Testament, the day begins with the evening. What do we do when the sun sets? When we don't have electric light? We rest. We cease our labors, and then we come together. We eat, we fellowship, and we sleep. That's how the day begins. And then, after resting, when the day is half over, we join the sun and we join the Spirit in doing our work. Of course, God is working all night long, and we participate then with God halfway through the day in doing our work. So the rhythm of grace is that every single day we start with rest, and then we work. Rest comes before work. It's a gift. We don't have to earn it. And so this fundamentally is describing the giftedness of life and the giftedness of Sabbath rest. It is not something we can earn. You can't earn a gift. Okay. Number 3, in Scripture, Sabbath implicates every aspect of our life. In the book, I explore 4 particular and expansive areas in which our life intersects with Sabbath. Again, the Sabbath is not this add-on, optional sort of thing that we do when we think about it or have time. The biblical understanding, it is a rhythm that dictates our life, and it has implications for every aspect of our life. So the book is divided into 4 parts, exploring Sabbath and work, Sabbath and time, Sabbath and community, and Sabbath and creation. And through these 4 kind of meta categories, I'm exploring how Sabbath implicates how we understand our identity, work and the culture of work, the values of work in our culture today, have a very particular way in which they're trying to form us, form our behavior, form our understanding, form the way in which we make sense of our lives and whether or not our lives have meaning. That there are very specific values at work forming us in the larger culture that we live in. And the Sabbath is an act of protest. It's a counter-narrative to those values, trying to define us not based on what we do, what we have, or what people say or think about us, as Henry Nouwen once said, but rather our meaning is intrinsic to the fact that we're created in God's image, beloved of God. That's where we start in forming our identity. And we assert our dignity by resting and not feeling the need to earn everything that we do, which is one of the values that gets imposed on us in the larger work culture. Our relationship with time, busyness, distraction, social media, technology, all of those things I explore in the second one. In the third section, explore our relationships with each other and 2 particular themes of loneliness and exclusion. And so with loneliness, I'm really exploring the impact of capitalism. So it's really about the economics of Sabbath and the economic structures that shape us in profoundly significant ways that we're often invisible or ignorant of, and how Sabbath offers a counter-narrative there as well. And then exclusion, I explore the impact of the philosophical ideology of dualism and how dualism gets expressed in so many ways in our world today. It's not really a word we throw around very often, but we experience it in every aspect and every layer of experience today, from a polarized government to the polarizing nature of social media, to exclusive policies within the church, dualism. I describe dualism as a philosophy that survives through exclusion, and how the Sabbath offers a counter-narrative again to that sense of exclusion. And I explore particularly the role of Isaiah 56 and how Isaiah 56 is a passage after the exile that rewrites some of the Mosaic laws that bar certain people from worship at the temple. Isaiah 56 leans on the Sabbath as a way of rewriting exclusionary laws in direction towards belonging and inclusion. And how that gets reflected in the New Testament through the person and the work of Jesus. And finally, Sabbath and creation, how the Sabbath, you can't talk about the Sabbath biblically without talking about care of creation and the care of the land. As Tom Bogart, who many of you know, once said, we care for the creation that cares for us. And that is intrinsic to a Sabbath ethic in the Bible. So I'm trying to create an expansive vision of Sabbath, intersecting with all these different aspects of our life, but also trying to do that in ways that are very tangible. So in the Sabbath and creation section, for example, I talk primarily about eating practices and how anyone who eats participates in agriculture. Eating, Wendell Berry said, is an agricultural act. And so we are the end of the line that begins with planting and harvesting and calves being born and all of that. Okay, next is this threefold discipleship structure that I discerned as I was initially sort of creating the class that the book came out of. I believe that discipleship is this ongoing, not a linear process, but this ongoing cyclical process of life, death, and resurrection. That it's a formational structure. We're being oriented. So this is the language I use: orientation, disorientation, reorientation. We're constantly being oriented by the world that we live in to have certain values, to behave in certain ways, to think in certain ways about our neighbors or ourselves or the world that we live in or the land that we depend on. And many of the ways that we're being formed to believe and act in the world are antithetical to the Sabbath and antithetical to the gospel. And so the disorientation chapter is how the Sabbath values come into conversation with the cultural values that are shaping us and help disorient that orientation that we're receiving. And then the reorientation chapters are offering Sabbath practices that help week after week reorient us towards a way of living in the world that resonates with the heart of God. And so each of the 4 parts of the book have 3 chapters: an orientation chapter, a disorientation chapter, and a reorientation chapter. So how are we being shaped by the culture of work? How does the Sabbath disorient us in that formation? And then how might a Sabbath practice reorient us week after week to show up differently to our work in ways that are more faithful, more grace-filled, and more vital for our own hearts and souls. The 5th thing I learned, as I referred to earlier, is that Sabbath is both a practice and a posture. And one of the things that Jane was referring to this morning of the driving the speed limit and not using the words busy and hurry are some of the attempts that I've made in my own life to adopt a Sabbath posture as a way of bringing the values that I'm steeping myself in week after week on my Sabbath day, trying to bring those into my work week. That functions at a very different rhythm from my Sabbath day. So I've adopted a practice of not speeding whenever I drive. Whatever road I'm on, I set my cruise at the speed limit and let everybody pass me. And then feel a sense of self-righteousness when I pull up alongside them at the next light have this deep desire to just wave at them and say, how's that rushing working out for you? That's my own sin I'm working on. But trying to bring these practices that help me slow down, that help me be more present to my life as I'm living it. Because for years and years and years, I was a speeder. I love to move fast through the world. And I also don't have a great time management practice, so I would always leave late. And so I would always feel like I'd have to rush wherever I was going. And as I started really taking the Sabbath seriously, actually this practice of speeding came from a student of mine, of not speeding. The first time I taught the Sabbath class, I had the students make a to-don't list as something that they would intentionally not do on their Sabbath day. And one of the students said he was going to not speed every Sabbath day, which for him then grew into every day. And he is still, 6 years later, I saw him last week, he's still practicing that. And I read his paper and I thought, that's brilliant and terrifying. I'm gonna try this. And 6 years later, I'm still doing it. But what it has done for me is that for years and years and years, as I would rush, my body would arrive wherever I'm going before my soul. And I would arrive, whether it's just rushing to a meeting within the seminary, walking quickly and being late, or rushing to a meeting with a friend, or wherever I was going, I would not arrive there as the best version of myself. I would arrive anxious, rushed, apologetic, and then I would bring that anxiety and that anxious energy into the meeting that I was going to. And I realized that I didn't want to show up that way. I wanted to try to adopt a practice that would help me, enable me to show up, to at least be more likely to show up with the best version of myself available to me in that moment. And so that has been a Sabbath, an explicitly Sabbath practice that I adopt throughout the week. The one that I'm still working on is walking slowly in the building. I like to put these long legs to work. I like to move quickly through the world, so trying to slow down. Sixthly, my goal in the book was to inspire as opposed to require people to Sabbath. I think that part of I appreciate kind of the impulse behind the Puritan Sabbath, this sort of enforced Sabbath with a kind of universal list of prohibitions. I appreciate the impulse behind that. But I think that the impact of it or the effect of it often tends to shift the emphasis towards control as opposed to delight and life. And it also tends to shift the conversation towards guilt and shame for not practicing Sabbath. I can't tell you how many people in the last few months since the book came out have come up to me and apologized for not practicing Sabbath, or have sort of confessed their sins to me, as Jane did earlier this morning, about, I'm not doing Sabbath right, or something like that. And I was really aware of that as I was writing the book, and it was I was very concerned with writing it in a tone that wouldn't compel people to respond with guilt or shame. I can't tell you how many sermons I've heard in my life on the Sabbath that my primary takeaway was, I'm not doing this right. And that's not what I want you to take away from the book. What I want you to take away from the book is, I can do this. I want to do this. And I can. I believe that it's possible for me in the specific circumstances of my life to move towards this kind of rhythm, to experience this kind of deep gift from the Spirit week after week, to reconnect with those things that make me feel most fully myself, that help me posture myself, like in the poem, with my hands cupped to receive my life, the song that is my life. Not to keep it and hoard it, but so that I can go out and faithfully, compellingly offer it to the world so worthy of rescue. That's what I wanted to do in the book. And finally, I wanted it to be practical, that every chapter includes a series of questions embedded in that chapter's content, and my hope was that groups would come together and process the book together, that it wouldn't be an isolated experience, but a communal experience, because the isolated Sabbath is almost impossible to sustain in this moment in history, but a communal Sabbath, you draw power from each other to sustain that practice. But also there's a specific practice I offer at the end of each chapter with the intention of you just being able to adopt or adjust that practice to your own life for the coming week. I don't think I'm going to talk about this, just in the interest of time. If you would like to have some help in creating and crafting and designing a Sabbath practice for you and your family, you can go to my website, travis-west.com/practices, and you can download a PDF where I guide you through the process of thinking through how to begin, how to conclude a Sabbath, and then how to fill that time that you create with meaningful things. I've gone on longer than I wanted to, so why don't we have some conversation? What questions do you have? What thoughts or comments or feedback do you want to offer? Yeah.
So you just mentioned families, and
It's not working. Yeah, it's right there.
It was, but it just goes off.
all right, better now?
There we go.
You just mentioned families and family practices. Just speak a little bit more about that, raising children with Sabbath,
Yeah.
and in the countercultural way that they would be required to do that is very hard.
Yeah.
And tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a really important question and conversation. One of the things that I try to do in the book is I worked very hard not to be prescriptive about a Sabbath practice, but rather to name values that people can hold in mind as they come together to design their Sabbath practice. Because I think one of the problems with the historical Sabbath is that it has been prescriptive, and those prescriptions don't work with every family or with every situation, and sometimes can actually make the day far more onerous, and generally make the children in the family resentful, and then significantly diminish the likelihood that they will continue on with the Sabbath practice when they reach adulthood. So I very much tried not to be prescriptive, but another one of the reasons why is that what I consider work, you might consider delight. And what you consider delight, you might consider work. And so because we are all so unique and different in our life contexts, are so different from each other, that's another reason why I wanted to not be prescriptive about certain types of work that you have to give up on Sabbath or something like that. So I tried to offer more of a framework of values that people can adopt and adjust to their life circumstances. But, Sabbath will look very different for retirees than for parents with young children. It just absolutely will look very different. It's one of the things that I tried to kind of name in that paragraph that I read earlier, that Sabbath it's not going to be an idyllic vision of rest and contentment and quiet when you have a toddler who wakes up at 5 o'clock every morning, regardless of what time they go to bed. And so some of the practice is going to just have to adapt to the life stage that the family is in and what is and isn't possible. And it will then evolve as the children age and different things become possible. One of the things that I try to do with this worksheet is encourage families to include their children in the design of the Sabbath day so that the children have agency of a voice and also get to contribute and help dictate what happens on the Sabbath day. Maybe a 2-year-old can't have that voice, but a 6 or 7-year-old could, and could begin to think about, okay, what creates anxiety for me? When do I feel stressed? What am I doing that feels onerous or feels like it might be more like work? And what do I love to do? When do I feel most connected to my family or to my siblings or to my parents? What are the things that make me feel most myself? And then to have a conversation as a family about those things. And so if everyone fills out one of these worksheets and everyone defines what is work and what is delight, and then everyone works together and talks together about, okay, what are the work things we're not going to do this week? Each of us are not going to do. And what are the delight things that we can make room for by not doing those work things? That's kind of the conversation I'm hoping to stimulate with this. And also just the reminder that your Sabbath will never be perfect. The point of Sabbath is not perfection. It's not mastery. It's just attempting to make space to come together, to experience God together, and to deepen our joy in living. And that's not going to happen every week. The first 10 years of our Sabbath experience, Mariah and I had all of our worst fights on Sabbath. And that's partly because we were doing this bastard Sabbath rhythm, where we were running, especially I was running for 6 days so fast, none of the things that we needed to talk about, I was running faster than those things. And then when I collapsed, all those things caught up. And then it created this tense context for us that we ended up in a fight. And we were so committed to Sabbath, we kept pushing through, even though most of our Sabbath days were kind of miserable. Eventually, we figured it out. So I don't know if that's fully answering your question, but those are some of the thoughts that come to my mind. Yeah.
When I was working full-time, this whole notion of having a day would have been wonderful because of the demands of the work world are really quite unreasonable sometimes. Yeah. However, now that I'm in retirement, I'm struggling with the notion of taking 24 hours in a week, as opposed to having an hour here and an hour there that looks like Sabbath, as opposed to consecutive hours. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you think about that.
Yeah. My initial thought is you don't have to choose that. I would consider those kind of an hour here, an hour there to be within this frame of the Sabbath posture. Ways in which you're making intentional connections between that day and your other experience. In retirement, your Sabbath might look quite different from what it would have looked like during your work years. Because the distinctions, the rhythms of your life are very different. But another way that Mariah and I have been discovering, even after I finished writing the book, some of these things have been emerging for us, is that one of the most important ways that we engage our Sabbath now is to pay attention to where we're stuck. Where are we getting stuck in our life? And one of the ways that we do that is through an intentional journaling practice. And so one of the gifts or the invitations of Sabbath is to step back from our lives to gain some perspective on how we're living and who we're becoming while we're living that way. What are the connections? How are our sort of implicit, tacit, thoughtless patterns and habits in life, how are those shaping us? Towards what end are they shaping us? Are we moving into cultivating joy and gratitude and trust in our lives, or are we cultivating resentment or frustration or a sense of stuckness in our life? And when we step back from those normal rhythms and have a complete day that's a different rhythm and that's shifting us towards a different perspective and a different way of being, that helps us get clarity on those rhythms that we've maybe blindly cultivated in our lives or unintentionally cultivated in our lives. And I think that is that would benefit us regardless of what season of life that we're in, because we're always falling into patterned ways of being. And so I think that the Sabbath can help that. But it can also give us the permission to orient ourselves towards the things that we love and delight in the most. That I don't know you or how you live the days of your life, but if you feel some resistance or hesitance to lean into the things that you love the most throughout the week, then the Sabbath day, a full day, could give you permission to really lean into that and explore that, re-explore that. But another reason for a full day is that it takes a lot of time to get out of our habituated ways of being. And that's why the threshold ritual is so important, to name a moment in which you're shifting from regular time to Sabbath time, and actually have a ritual, an act, and a moment in time that you shift from one to the other. Because it takes a lot of time. You can have that moment that you mark, but your body might take a few hours to really get into that Sabbath time, Sabbath space. And so because it takes a while to get into it, it's helpful to have 24 hours as opposed to, say, 2 or 3 hours. Yeah.
I actually have 2 questions. The first one is a quick one. To understand, you and your wife then do Sabbath usually on starting Friday night?
That's right.
And then the all-day Saturday?
That's right. That's what we do.
So
yeah.
you do your 24 hours there.
Yep.
So for people, then it brings me to my second question, for people who, the privilege, you talk in your book a little bit about the privilege of Sabbath,
Right.
who work on Saturday.
Yep.
Is this something I'm going to pick Tuesday as my Sabbath day, or Wednesday or something like that? Is that something you'd say, okay, that's all right, or
Absolutely.
you kind of do whatever? And I guess quite frankly, I'm feeling, even though I'm retired, it's like, man, 24 hours, you got to be kidding me. There's no way. So anyway,
Yeah.
I just wondered if you wanted to comment on the privilege of Sabbath.
Yeah, well, there's a few things in there. For many people that I know, they become more busy after they stop working than they were during their work time. So many things to respond to. I'm not prescriptive in the book about any of this, and so I want it to be received as a gift as opposed to something that people feel obligated to do, or that they have to do it the right way. I don't think that those kinds of right and wrong categories even make sense with the Sabbath. And so if the rhythms of your life mean a Tuesday is the day that you're able to find that rhythm, the point is for it to be rhythmic. So it's more ideal to have it be every Tuesday than Tuesday this week and Thursday next week and Monday the following week and then Saturday. If that's the only thing you can do, then something is not nothing. But the idea of it being a rhythm that begins to become a container that holds your life, I think is ideal. But the question of privilege is really significant, and it is a reality in our world today that Sabbath is a privilege and a luxury that not everyone can afford. So there is such a thing as Sabbath privilege. The economic conditions that shape and determine many of our lives often do not leave space for some people to practice Sabbath. They need to work 7 days a week in order to put food on the table for their children or keep a roof over their head. So it's important to name that. But at the same time, it was very important to me in the book, and I learned this from one of my favorite poets, Ross Gay, from his book, Inciting Joy, that he talks about things like gardening and delight. I think of Ross Gay as the poet laureate of delight. He's written a few books on delight that have been really impactful to me. But he talks about those kinds of things, naming that we often talk about them using the language of privilege. But he says the problem with naming a fundamental human right a privilege is that it obscures the fact that that is the result of an injustice. And that injustice is actually the point of the system that we've constructed. The economic system functions in such a way to marginalize people economically. That's a part of, it's native to the economic system as financial exploitation. And so he says it actually obscures that to call it a privilege. So he changes the language and he calls it a disprivilege, to be excluded from the economic potential to experience delight or to have access to clean water or whatever the basic human right might be, to which I add Sabbath. And so that perspective on Sabbath is not, it is a privilege, but it also obscures the fact, to call it a privilege, it obscures the fact that that privilege is the result of economic injustice. And so to call it a disprivilege shines a light on the fact, well, what it does is it helps clarify the work that we who have the ability to Sabbath ought to be doing the other 6 days of the week. We ought to be participating in the world in such a way that adjusts those economic realities so that everybody can experience Sabbath. Everyone at least has the agency to make the choice about whether or not they're going to practice Sabbath. And so that's one of the ways in which you can't talk about Sabbath without talking about work. And Sabbath helps clarify the purpose or the point or the telos of our work. So thanks for that.
Thank you. I know some of you still have questions. You may have to chat with Travis later. I'm sorry. But it seems difficult for me to have to say if we're late for worship.
Yeah, right, yeah.
I hear about it.
Well, we've been worshiping as well.
Exactly. Thank you, Travis. Thank you very much.
Also, let me just say quickly that if you don't have a book yet, I have some available if you'd like to get one, or if you have your book and want me to sign it, I'm happy to do that as well.
I was just going to say
Okay,
that.
good.
Yep, there are books here, and yep, Travis has already signed mine, and he's willing to do that for you. And there are bookmarks for the course. We're studying this book in the month of October. We started this past week. The bookmarks have the reading schedule on them, so if you still need a bookmark, there are a few of them there, and please grab one. Next week, there's nothing happening in politics this time. Why we need to talk about it? Yeah, right. So next week is partisan and politic and party and policy, and our own Gordon Wiersma and Lois Mawson will be talking about some of that. And as it says, we're going to sort through the challenge of how to engage faithfully, wisely, legally, and hopefully. So please join us for that next week as well. Thank you.